Survivor is one of the most influential television shows ever made. Its simple premise has allowed it to survive for over 20 years, maintaining a loyal audience of millions during a time when cable TV is all but dead. The actual rules of Survivor are very easy to understand. You take 16 to 20 random people and throw them on an island in the middle of nowhere. They then have to survive for 39 days with very little outside contact. The twist is that every 3 days or so, the castaways are forced to vote people out of the game. But once it gets down to the last 2 or 3 people, a small group of the most recently eliminated players are brought back to the island, and they are the ones who vote for one of the remaining contestants to win the season. The winner then gets a grand prize of $1 million, although some sources say that it becomes closer to $600,000 after Obama takes some of it. While Survivor has evolved a lot over the years, this core idea has never been altered. If you want to win Survivor, you have to find a way to not only vote off and eliminate all the other players, but at the same time, you have to remain on good enough terms with these people so that they will still choose to give you $1 million over whoever is left. Over 44 seasons, 42 players have been lucky enough to be crowned the sole survivor, and these winners come in all shapes and sizes. Naturally, one of the most common debates in the Survivor community is discussing who the best and worst winners are. There is no one right answer for who the best Survivor winner is. Everywhere you go, different people will give you different answers. But the same cannot be said for the question of who the worst Survivor winner is. Because, no matter where you look or who you talk to, you are almost certainly only going to hear one name come up: Chris Underwood. But just why is this one man so despised in the Survivor community? Why is he universally declared by all Survivor fans, from the most hardcore to the least knowledgeable, to be the worst winner Survivor has ever had? I mean, based on his manly and handsome physique, a Survivor outsider could probably guess that he did very well on a show all about surviving in the elements. Well, let's walk through the season that Underwood won, step by step. Survivor Season 38, Edge of Extinction. Before I go over the plot of the season, let me fill you in on some background information. This season began with 2 teams of 9 players, and they would merge into one tribe after episode 6. 14 of these players, including Chris, were newcomers and had never played before. But 4 of these players were returned contestants from previous seasons, and all of them had done very well. These returning players would be split evenly among the 2 tribes. Chris Underwood was placed on the Manu tribe, along with veterans Kelly Wentworth and David, and newcomers Wendy, Wardog, Lauren, Keith, Rick Devins, and Reem. So now, let's see what Chris did that makes his win so undeserved. Chris had a pretty boring first 2 episodes. He literally did not get a confessional in the season premiere, and after 2 episodes, all we really knew about him was that he was very good at challenges despite his team losing the first 2 immunities. We also knew he was in the Majority 6 alliance, but was thinking about turning on Wentworth, one of his alliance members. It's not that unusual for winners to get a quiet first few episodes. In fact, some winners barely get shown off during the entire pre-merge. But so far, we are not off to a great start. However, Chris would have a breakout episode in episode 3. He first carries his team to their first challenge win, which was a reward challenge for some chickens. But they end up losing immunity for the 3rd consecutive time. Before Tribal Council, David and Devin decide now is their time to take out Wentworth. They rope in Chris and Wendy, but Chris wants Wardog to be in on the vote too, as he does not want to turn on them this early in the game. So despite David explicitly telling Chris to not tell Wardog, Chris decides to tell Wardog anyway, hoping to build a stronger relationship with him. However, Wardog actually wants to work with Wentworth way more than he wants to work with Chris. So, Wardog tries to turn the vote on the Chris himself. Wardog asks Devins to help vote out Chris, along with Wentworth and Lauren, and then Devins ends up telling David about the new plan. Now, David and Devins can decide between their original plan of voting out Wentworth, or they can go with Wardog's plan of voting out Chris. But, since we know that Chris wins the season, it seems obvious who they choose to go with, right? I mean, there is no possible way that Chris would be voted out and still...
3rd person voted out of Survivor. Chris, that's 4, that's enough. Need to bring me a torch.
Oh. The reason that Chris Underwood is unanimously declared Survivor's worst winner is that, technically, he was voted out 3rd. I have been avoiding mentioning that part for as long as I could, but this is all it really comes down to. He was voted out 3rd, but due to a twist this season, he was allowed to come back into the game and then win. That is why people loathe Chris's win so much, and many fans believe it to be undeserved. However, before I actually explain my thoughts on Chris's win, we need to finish the season. After Chris was voted out, he chose to go to the Edge of Extinction. This was a secret island being used to house the players who were voted off. The island was even more barren and deserted than the islands actually being used by the tribes. There were no challenges or tribal councils for people to attend to. Occasionally, the producers had them go on a scavenger hunt, but that would only last 1 or 2 hours. The only thing there was to do was wait an unspecified amount of days for them to have a chance to re-enter into the game, and who knows how long that would be. When Chris got to the edge, Reem and Keith, 2 people he previously voted off, were already living there. The 2 of them, still pissed, mocked Chris to his face and refused to be friendly. However, instead of feeding into their hate, Chris decided to actually make himself useful and went fishing for the 3 of them. And by the end of the episode, this act of kindness allows Reem and Keith to forgive Chris. In the next episode, a scavenger hunt is held. Chris ends up winning materials that he can use to practice for the upcoming Get Back in the Game challenge. However, Keith ends up winning another scavenger hunt, and he wins a reward that lets him put a disadvantage on another person during the challenge. Since Chris was the most physically intimidating person on the edge, Keith chose to disadvantage him. When the merge happens, the people on the edge reveal themselves to the remaining players and have a challenge to try and get back into the game. Ultimately, the disadvantage found by Keith outweighed the practice Chris had done, and Chris lost the Get Back in the Game challenge to Devins. However, he was given the opportunity to go back onto the edge and wait out until the final 5 to participate in another challenge to try and re-enter the game. While some players chose to leave the game right there, Chris was one of the 3 who stayed. Over the next 6 episodes and 18 in-game days, Chris lived on the edge, watching as more and more people were voted out and came to live with him, including one of Survivor's statistically best challenge performers in Joe. But he never gave up, and on day 35, another Get Back in the Game challenge was held. Chris got off to a slow start, with 3 other players being ahead of him when he got to the final stage. However, he was able to catch up to first place, and after Joe Anglim choked, Chris was able to win the Get Back in the Game challenge. After 27 days on the edge, Chris was finally going to be back in the game. But, in order for him to win, he would need to play perfectly. Nobody comes into Survivor wanting to vote for the 3rd boot to win. So, what did Chris do to win once he got back in the game? First, he had to survive the final 6 vote. This would especially be tricky, as while he was given a hidden immunity idol by the producers upon returning from the edge, he could not actually play it yet. He had to first give half of it to another player, survive a round, and then pray the other person would give it back to him so that he could use it. Chris chose to give his idol to Devins, his former tribemate who had previously come back from the edge, since Devins had also gotten the Edge of Extinction idol and knew Chris had one. Then, Chris weirdly threw the next immunity challenge, giving up on the final segment to help Bruhlie win the challenge. Despite this move seeming out of place for a situation, it had 2 purposes. The first was so he could establish a relationship with Bruhlie, a person he had met the day before. Because Chris had helped her out, Bruhlie chose to take him on the reward she had won, and also promised not to vote him out. The second reason Chris threw the immunity challenge was so that he could prove he did not need to win immunity to survive a vote. Instead, he was going to use his social game to convince Lauren to play her idol on him. Chris knew Lauren had an idol, as she had been allies with Wentworth, and Wentworth told Chris about Lauren's idol as soon as she made it to the edge. Chris lied to Lauren, saying that Wentworth wanted Lauren to make a big move by playing the idol on Chris. Lauren was fooled, and during Tribal Council, she played her idol for Chris. Only there was a small hiccup. Chris only received 1 vote, and was not going to go home regardless if Lauren played her idol. Chris had not only been able to avoid being targeted due to his newly built relationship with Bruhlie, but he had also gotten Lauren to waste her idol in the process, tanking her reputation in front of the jury. The next vote was pretty simple. Chris got his half of the idol back from Devins, and Devins found another idol, meaning that both of them were safe no matter what. At the next vote, the other 3 players voted for Chris, who played his idol, and he and Devins voted out Lauren. The next day, Chris steamrolled the other 3 players to win the final immunity challenge of the season. However, now he had an important decision to make. In Modern Survivor, the winner of the last immunity challenge gets to bring 1 other person to the final tribal council, and force the other 2 remaining players to have a fire-making challenge in order to see who gets the final spot. Chris knew Devins was too big of a threat to bring with, but he was torn between bringing Gavin and bringing Bruhlie, both of whom were not the best fire makers, but would also benefit from beating Devins. So, he decided to do something else. In an unprecedented move in Survivor history, Chris chose to give up his immunity so that he would be the one that faced Devins in fire. Winning would mean that Chris had just pulled off one of the most courageous moves in all of Survivor history. but by losing this challenge, he would go down as one of the stupidest players ever in Survivor. However, Chris's gambit paid off, and he not only beat Devin's, but also broke the record for fastest fire-making challenge victory in Survivor. Now, all it was left for him to do was convince the jury that he deserved the win over Gavin and Julie. During final tribal council, it was clear the jury was choosing between Chris and Gavin. I will talk about why this was the case later, but for now, let's look at their arguments. Chris's argument was that he strategically chose to be a provider on the Edge, that he had literally played perfectly during the final 4 days, and that Gavin was a follower who never had a single move he could take credit for. Gavin's argument was that he was never voted out, was almost always in the majority, and that he never received a vote against him in the game. Although it appeared like he did not realize this until Devins pointed it out. Ultimately, the jury voted for Chris in a 9-4-0 vote split. That is the entirety of Chris's game summed up. It was pretty good, except for the part where he was voted out third. There are two big opinions I see in the Survivor community on Chris's win. The first is that Chris's win was undeserved and that Gavin should have won. The second is that Chris is the worst Survivor winner, but he still deserved the win. The first opinion I believe to be objectively false, while the second opinion I disagree with subjectively. I will first explain why Chris deserved to win this season despite being voted out third. The common belief is that Chris only won Survivor because he was friends with the jury and never had to betray anyone. However, this is a highly uncharitable interpretation of Chris's game, as it understates the level of difficulty this task poses. It is true that Chris had to vote out significantly less people than Gavin did, and that he was on good terms with the jury, but in order to get back into the game in the first place, he still had to beat most of the jury in the Get Back in the Game challenge, and eliminate them. The jury could have been bitter that they were not the ones who came back, and that the athletic guy voted out third beat them, but they were not, because Chris was not a jerk. In a similar vein, Chris had to not be a bad person on the Edge. That sounds obvious, but really think about that for a second. Chris was living on a deserted island for 27 days, where there was barely any food, water, or shelter, with a bunch of people who just had their dream of winning Survivor ruined. On top of all of that, there is almost nothing to break up this monotony unlike in regular Survivor. It is just sit and wait however long the producers tell you to. Nearly every time we saw the Edge of Extinction, someone was complaining about how hard it was, or talking about how depressed and alone everyone felt. How many people would actually be able to handle living under these circumstances for a whole month, without turning into an angry, depressed person themselves? Not only was Chris able to avoid the toxicity of the Edge, but he went above and beyond, acting as a provider for the people living there. As I previously stated, the only other people on the Edge when Chris got there were people he had voted out, and they mocked Chris to his face. Instead of getting defensive, Chris woke up the next morning and went fishing for the three of them, bringing back their first passable meal in days. This was not a one-time thing. We consistently saw Chris fish and provide for his tribe, when most of the other Edge inhabitants wallowed in despair. In the first half of the season, Chris was always the one who went out in the morning and brought back messages from the producers. There was also a scene where another player living on the Edge, Eric, sees Chris catch a stingray while fishing, and this act inspires Eric to stay on the Edge and not give up on his goal of re-entering the game. Nobody else on the Edge was edited in this way, not even any of the returning players. Chris, while it may be a stretch to say he was the leader of the Edge, was a positive force on the Edge and made the other players' lives better. I bet not everyone that was there can say that. When you hear someone say like Chris only won Survivor because he was friends with the jury, it's like, how else are you supposed to win? The jury votes for a person they want to receive $1 million. They obviously will not vote for someone they dislike. The majority of the players voted for Chris because not only were they impressed by his final few days, but because they had formed genuine bonds with Chris that Chris did not have to form. Chris was not gifted these friendships by the producers upon going to the Edge. He had to do things that made people like him. That's a hard thing to do in Survivor, let alone on the Edge. The same can be said for another common argument Chris deniers like to bring up, which is that the jury members believe that a vote for Chris was like a vote for themselves, or that by not voting for Chris, they were admitting that they never could have won if they came back from the Edge. Because it's practically impossible to improve on Chris's game. Again, yes, that is indeed how Survivor works. I am sure every jury member ever on Survivor wishes that they had played the game that the person they voted for had played. You could say the same thing about any jury member who voted for one of their alliance members to win Survivor, or any jury member who voted for someone who started out on their original tribe. No one ever says Aurora only voted for Gavin because they were in an alliance together, and therefore Aurora voting for Gavin would be like her voting for herself. The craziest thing about this whole argument is that, at the same time, Chris was not really as good at this as I'm hyping him up to be. You see, Reem, the first person voted out, had never actually met Gavin or Julie while she was playing Survivor, but had spent weeks with Chris on the Edge. So it seems like Chris had a free guaranteed vote in Reem then, right? Well, after the game, Reem revealed that Chris was actually the person she argued with the most on the Edge. However, she still voted for him because, although she and Chris had personal differences, it did not outweigh the respect she had for Chris's overall game. Also, when Chris deniers bring up Reem never meeting Julie or Gavin, they conveniently ignore the players Chris did not meet until the last 5 days of the game. I briefly mentioned how Aurora, a person who spent 25 in-game days with Gavin, but only a single night with Chris, unsurprisingly voted for Gavin. But, even more shocking is that, despite Gavin and Victoria spending 36 in-game days together, being each other's self-declared biggest allies through 35 of those days, and Chris and Victoria only interacting for less than 48 hours, Victoria voted for Chris to win Survivor. I will talk more about why Gavin deserved to lose in a few minutes, but that one fact is basically a smoking gun. If you still think anyone could have done what Chris did on the Edge, or that his win was undeserved, then I have one more example that should change your mind. It is Season 40, Winners at War, and Natalie Anderson, the winner of Survivor San Juan del Sur, was just voted out first overall. However, like the season Edge of Extinction, Winners at War also used the Edge of Extinction twist, so Natalie was still in the game. Over the next 33 days, Natalie works her butt off on the Edge, finding advantages and sources of food. When the final Get Back in the Game challenge happens, Natalie wins, and she re-enters the game after being voted out first. She then plays 2 hit immunity idols back-to-back to save herself from elimination, wins the final immunity challenge, and forces the 2 biggest threats left to duke it out and fire. Theoretically, if the Edge was so easy to exploit for the return player, then Natalie should easily win just like Chris did. She not only played great upon coming back from the Edge, but she also should have established great relationships with everyone on the jury. But Natalie only receives 4 votes, and a guy named Tony ends up beating her. There are a few reasons why Chris won but Natalie did not. For one, Chris's game was simply more impressive than Natalie's. Chris put himself in fire while Natalie did not. He survived more days off of the Edge, and he also technically survived a vote post-merge without immunity, which Natalie could not do. However, like I have been saying for the past 5 minutes, Natalie was not guaranteed good relationships with the jury just because she spent a lot of time with them. In fact, after the game, it came out that Natalie was mean to some people on the Edge, purposely excluding some of the later Edge inhabitants from her social group. So, when it came time to vote, these people felt scorned by Natalie, and instead voted for Tony. Chris could have hoarded all the fish he caught to himself, so that he was by far the most prepared for the Get Back in the Game challenge. Instead, he shared it with everyone, no matter how much they argued with him every day. This idea sounds so simple to execute, but Natalie was a former winner, and not even she could replicate this strategy. She let her ego get the better of her, acted selfishly, and paid the price during the final tribal council. Natalie did have one other disadvantage compared to Chris. Tony, the guy who beat Natalie, is arguably the greatest Survivor player in the history of the show. Gavin and Julie are arguably the worst Survivor finalists in the history of the show. That's the thing Chris deniers either do not realize or do not mention. In order to claim Chris did not deserve his win, you have to provide an adequate argument as for why Gavin or Julie should have won instead. This task has been proven to be very difficult. Explaining why Chris deserved to beat Julie is pretty easy, as you can point to a single round where she ruined her chance at winning. During the final 11, there were 4 separate alliances left in the game. There was the duo of Devins and David, the trio of Lauren, Wardog, and Wentworth, the duo of Julie and Ron, and then the other 4 players. The previous vote, the group of 4 along with Wardog's group, teamed up to vote out Eric, who was a part of Julie and Ron's alliance. Now, it seemed like the group of 4 was in control of the other 7 players because, individually, none of their alliances could stack up to theirs. However, during tribal council that night, the stress of the game caused Julie to suffer a literal mental breakdown, causing her to openly disregard the alliance of 4, and instead try to work with the other alliances. While this move did technically work, it came off as highly emotional, sporadic, and off-putting to the rest of the players. No one really took her seriously the rest of the game. Explaining why Chris deserved to beat Gavin is a little bit more complicated, but what it comes down to is that Chris literally did more of his 12 days of actual Survivor than Gavin did with 39. Maybe it was a bit more black and white in the game, but I rewatched the Edge of Extinction season to prepare for this video, and there was not a single vote that Gavin actively controlled. Reading interviews from the contestants after the game backs this up. Joe's elimination was Ron's idea. Ron's elimination was Victoria's idea. All three of Eric, David, and Wentworth's eliminations were spearheaded by War Dog. Gavin may have been a part of these eliminations, but he was never the one leading the charge. The one time he was even in a swing vote position was in Ron's elimination, as there his alliance kinda let him choose between who he wanted the backup target to be by giving him an extra vote, although they still strongly suggested that Gavin voted for Ron. Ironically, voting for Ron ended up being a bad move, as Gavin just had a heart-to-heart with Ron about how much it meant to Gavin that Ron brought him on a reward. It is true that Chris barely had to vote any of the players out and deal with the typical fallout, but Gavin also did not have to mishandle these votes as badly as he did. The truth is that, just like every other player who's won Survivor, Chris deserved to win his season. If this was not the case, he would not have won. It is not the audience who decides who wins a season of Survivor. It is the other players who were actually there and played the entire time. It is absurd that so many people disagree with this belief. If you want to say that Chris was not the best player in his season, that's fine by me, as I think there is often a difference between the best player and the winner of a season. But Chris deserved to win, especially over his competition. With that being said, however, is Chris even the worst winner in Survivor history? There are a variety of reasons why Survivor fans consider Chris to be the worst winner of the game. Some of these reasons I previously mentioned in the last section, so I will try to focus on new arguments. The first and most obvious reason for this belief is that Chris was voted out. No other person in American Survivor was voted out and then went on to win the exact season except for Chris. So obviously, he must be the worst winner by default. Very few people are lucky enough to play on a season of Survivor where voted out players can come back into the game. Chris was, so his win comes down to nothing more than luck. While I do understand this perspective, I do not agree with it. Survivor Edge of Extinction was not the first season of Survivor to have a twist where eliminated players can re-enter the game. Similar twists had previously been done in Season 7, 22, 23, and 27. While Chris obviously only won because of this twist, the twist itself was not unprecedented or thrown in at the last minute. Plus, after the merge, every player in the game became aware of the Edge, and had time to prepare for when the second Get Back in the Game challenge occurred. It was not like Chris was the beneficiary of an absurdly unlikely chance event happening in Survivor. All Chris did was play within the rules of the game during his season. And during his season, the rules of the game stated that if you were voted out before the final 5, you have an opportunity to come back into the game via a skill-based challenge. If you want to talk about the unprecedented twist in Survivor history helping people win Survivor, let's take a trip to Season 13, Cook Islands. That season was the first season in Survivor history to have a Final 3 instead of the Final 2. And sure enough, it featured one of the most athletically dominant players in Survivor history, Ozzy Luth, who tied the record for most individual immunity wins in a single season. If Survivor waited just one more season to implement the Final 3, then it seems all but certain that Ozzy would win the Final Immunity Challenge, vote out the obvious winner candidate in Yule, and coast to a landslide victory. Instead, thanks to the Final 3 twist, Yule beat Ozzy in a close 5-4-0 vote. Just 3 seasons later, in Survivor Micronesia, the reverse happened. At the Final 3, Jeff Probst announced that they would be going back to a surprise Final 2 for the season. This last-second change led to the elimination of a potential winner candidate in Suri Fields. And instead, Parvati Shallow went on to win the season. While technically, we do not know for sure if Parvati or Yule would have still won their seasons had these twists not occurred, it is almost certain that their paths to victory would have been much, much harder. I could go on and on, but I think you get the picture. Every Survivor winner ever has specific advantages relative to just their season over other winners. Everything down to what tribe they are put on, and what challenges the producers decide to run in a season, has a huge effect on a person's chances at winning. Yet these factors are completely luck-based. You could put 95% of the Survivor winners on the worst performing tribe in Survivor history, Yulong, and chances are none of them are making it to the merge. That is just how Survivor is. Some things will go your way and other things will not. In order to win Survivor, you have to make sure the things that do go your way outweigh the things that are not, and Chris was able to do this. It is also worth mentioning why Chris was voted out third. because based on what the episode showed us, it does not seem like Chris really did a lot wrong. If you remember, Chris was part of a group of 4 who were gonna vote out Wentworth, and the idea was not even Chris's plan. However, in order to not piss off War Dog, Chris informs him of this plan before they go to Tribal Council as a sign of loyalty, instead of thanking Chris for informing him about the new plan, or just trying to convince him to not vote Wentworth. War Dog betrays Chris and turns the vote onto him. Even weirder is that despite still having the numbers to take out Wentworth, Devins and David betray Chris too. In the long run, this turns out to be the wrong move for those two, as during the next Tribal Council, War Dog's group of 3 vote Devins out and make it clear to David that he would be voted out if they return again. Had the 2 of them kept Chris around, then they would have kept the majority. All Chris did was try to strengthen his alliance with another tribe member. That's not really bad gameplay. Should he have been more aware that this person was not to be trusted? Obviously, but there are literally hundreds of more egregious cases of someone being voted out due to their own actions. Out of everyone who was voted out in Edge of Extinction, I would argue that Chris did the least wrong to be voted out. On top of all this, we literally saw someone make the exact same quote-unquote mistake Chris did later in the season, only there it actually worked. During the Eric boot, War Dog tells David about the plan to vote for Eric, and David decides to tell Devins this plan to try and strengthen their alliance. However, Devins does not end up turning the vote onto David, although he does decide to work with Eric during the episode anyway. Chris did not forget to play his idol, alienate everyone on his tribe by acting strangely, or smuggle in beef jerky. All he did to be voted out was tell someone information that, in hindsight, they should not have known. Many people also take issue with the fact that Chris was given an idol by the producers when he came back at the final 5. Again, I understand why people are mad, but I did not think it was as big of a deal as people make it to be. For one, it was not a free idol like the Chris deniers would have you believe. He could not use it at the final 6 whatsoever, since he had to give half of it to someone else. Then, he could only use it at the final 5 if he got it back from whoever gave it to him. Devins could have not given Chris his idol back. In this scenario, Chris would be voted out at 5, and Devins would have a better shot at making it to final 3. Instead, Chris used his social abilities to convince Devins to give him back the idol. Not everyone is that socially capable, and I think most people playing Survivor would be unable to get the idol back and fall short of the final 4. Another big criticism people have of Chris's game comes from interviews players gave after the season. There, it was revealed that Chris did not independently come up with a plan over what to do once he was back into the game. The plan's creator was mainly War Dog, although it was formed over a big group conversation on the Edge. Because Chris did not come up with his strategy, many people view his win less favorably, including Victoria, one of the players who voted for Chris, and was not made aware of this fact until after the game was over. Using this line of thinking, does this mean that anyone who has ever utilized a split vote in Survivor was just copying Cowboy strategy on Survivor Cook Islands? Furthermore, anyone who has ever used a hidden immunity idol correctly should not receive any credit for coming up with the idea to play it, except for Gary Hoagboom in Survivor Guatemala, since he was the first person who played it correctly. Once again, I understand what these people are trying to say, but I just disagree. I do not think it really matters that Chris did not independently come up with a strategy. While it would have been more impressive if he had, he still needed to actually pull it off. How many people on the Edge of Extinction could have actually done that? Even though War Dog was a great strategist, he sucked major ass at all the challenges, and would have never won the Get Back in the Game challenge in a million years. Aurora might have been able to win the Get Back in the Game challenge had Chris not been there, but is she socially skilled enough to convince Lauren to play the idol on her? Wentworth may have been able to convince Lauren to play the idol on her, but would she also be able to gain Devin's trust and have him hand back the idol? Ron may have been able to do both of these things, but would he be physically capable to win the final immunity challenge? Julia might be physically skilled enough to win the final immunity challenge, but was she bold enough to put herself into fire against Devins and then actually win? Finally, Joe Anglo might have been able to do all of these things I just mentioned if Chris had not been there, but if certain rumors about him are to be believed, he probably would not have the needed respect as a person to have won the game in the end. The truth is that, as much as people want to argue otherwise, what Chris did was hard, and very few Survivor players could pull it off. I just explained how Natalie, a previous winner who had the privilege of seeing Edge of Extinction before playing her season, was unable to replicate Chris's game. Not everyone can play Survivor like Natalie, not everyone can play Survivor like Tony, and not everyone can play Survivor like Chris. Who cares if Chris was voted off on day 8? Almost 80 players have been given an opportunity to come back into the game after being voted out. So far, only Chris turned that opportunity into a win. I think he deserves more credit for that than what most people give him. I previously mentioned that if you believe that Chris's win was undeserved, you need to make a good argument for either Gavin or Bruhlie win over him. Likewise, if I'm arguing that Chris is not the worst Survivor winner in history, which I am, then there needs to be at least one winner I believe played a worse game than Chris Underwood. There are actually a few people I think fit this description. The first and most obvious one is Ben from Survivor Season 35, Heroes vs Healers vs Hustlers. Ben actually played an alright game until the last 10 days or so, when it became clear that he was the biggest threat to win. Ben only managed to last longer due to him finding a hidden immunity idol before every tribal council. Then he was able to win the fire making challenge in the final 4, and won in a decisive 5-2-1 vote. The reason why I think Ben's win was the worst, and why most people also consider it to be not great, is due to allegations of the producers rigging the game for Ben, or at least tilting the game in his favor. After the season, many people expressed their theory that some of the hidden immunity idols Ben had found were placed in spots that the producers knew Ben frequently was in, with the idea being Ben would be more likely to find it and save himself. However, even more damning is the fire making challenge Ben had won. This was the first ever season of Survivor that used this mandatory fire making challenge format at the final 4, and the players were not made aware of this until after the final immunity challenge. In the 34 previous seasons of the show, Ben would have been sent home in a predictable 3-1 vote, but since he was lucky enough to just so happen to be in the final 4 during the first season they used this twist, the former American Marine was able to build fire and sneak into the final 3. I think Ben's win is more luck-based than Chris's win, which is why I think Chris was a better winner than Ben. Furthermore, I also think there is an argument to be made over whether Chris is a better winner than the winners who also mostly won due to a strong social game. The main two I'm talking about are Michelle and Gabler. Although based on what I have heard, people like Natalie White and Fabio might fit this category. While these players were never voted out, and really did not do much wrong, they also never controlled anything or made any big, impressive moves that people could point to and say, wow, they were actively trying to put themselves into a better position throughout the game. Generally, these guys made it to the end by riding along with more aggressive, yet off-putting strategists, which is why the jury awarded a more likable person at the end. The reason I think it is not unreasonable to claim that Chris was a better winner than these guys is because Gavin, Chris's main competition in the final 3, played a very similar game to these winners, and Chris was able to beat Gavin. If you put Chris's winning game next to Michelle or Gabler or Fabio's winning games, then who is more likely to win? Furthermore, who actually faced more hardship during the game? The guy who was voted out 3rd, or the 4th in command of the majority alliance who never bothered to make a move? This question is impossible to answer objectively, and comes down to what you value more in Survivor players. Personally, I lean more towards Chris than the other guys, but at the same time, you can really only give the 3rd boot so much credit. That is going to do it for this video. This past year, I've been trying to end all my videos with some deep final paragraph about what the topic truly means to me or society, but today, I got nothing. I just think that too many people think about good and bad Survivor winners the same way, and want to defend someone that every other person would rather write off. If you enjoyed this video, then good for you. Thank you for watching.